we can do that.
Okay. Okay, it's my great pleasure. Dear students, do you hear us well? Okay, at least they follow us through YouTube, some of them. It's my pleasure to present our speaker, Father Laurent Clenewerck. He's a member of our faculty at the Ukrainian Catholic University at the Institute of Ecumenical Studies. He studied, actually he finished our program, distance learning program in Ecumenical Studies, and now we have a big privilege that he teaches at our program. Father Laurent likes to combine different sciences, yes, because he is a priest, but he has a theological education as well. But he finished also in other schools in computer sciences, international affairs, finance, and business administration. He teaches also not only in our university, but of course, first of all, in Evclid University. He is professor of international administration and theology, and also he teaches at Humboldt State University. He is an Orthodox priest in America, and he is a brilliant theologian. He wrote several articles about ecumenical dialogues, but he goes forward and he now works in the area of interfaith dialogue. And it's also good news that recently he was awarded for his work by the King of Abdullah in Jordan, and by Patriarch of Jerusalem Theophilus in the frame of the World Interfaith Harmony Week, which they care about interfaith dialogue. And Father Laurent was awarded for his many years of work. And I propose to, I'm passing word to you, Father Laurent, and to present your topic and to share your experience from your trip to Jordan. Thank you for participation in the online lecture.
Well, thank you for your kind introduction, Father Roman, and first I give glory to God for all things, for being safe back from all my trips, and I ask that we all ask God's blessing and guidance as we seek to be peacemakers according to the command of the Lord. So that was my spirit when over the years I experienced a shift, an evolution, or an expansion, one may say, which I think is now natural from ecumenical dialogue to interfaith dialogue. And here I just want to say that all of us, I believe, approach ecumenical work, ecumenical interest from a personal dimension. I think we need to recognize how personal this is. For me, for example, I am a Frenchman, so I come from a mostly Catholic environment, culturally, historically, although I wasn't raised myself Catholic, but my ancestral roots certainly were. And so when I became a Christian through the Orthodox witness, then it's my personal environment which in a way oriented my interest in Catholic Orthodox dialogue. It wasn't abstract, it wasn't pure theology, it was meeting people and trying to make sense of things, and ideally in a way that wouldn't uh, just be about ideas, but also about persons and convictions. And so I wrote my first book, which I discussed once here, um, called His Broken Body, which was about Catholic Orthodox dialogue, which I hope was a more constructive contribution to this sensitive and critical topic. But over the years, I also began to work with various people, including a number of very friendly, kind, and supportive Muslim men and women. And I had this encounter where I could sense that there was a caricature that was possible of Islam, especially with current events. And basically, there was a real possibility, a real risk that we would reduce Muslims to a particular caricature, and that out of fear, we would stop our interest in dialogue or even in publication. And so for those who are in the program at the Institute, some of them may have read my thesis, which was about ecumenical methods. And I tried to bring into my thesis, again, rather personal contributions, discussing my work with language, teaching critical thinking, and showing that language can be very helpful to create convergence, but also it can be very non-helpful. It can create additional confusion. I also discussed my work in science, how science can help us understand that concepts that seem to be very difficult to reconcile, in physics, for example, can in fact be reconciled if we really try hard. And then thirdly, I discussed how from diplomacy we can use some of the techniques used by diplomats to make, again, our ecumenical work, even our interfaith work, more effective. And here, I have to say that as we look at the world today, and that includes, in fact, not just the Middle East, but even Eastern Europe, we sense that interreligious, interfaith is, for better or worse, linked with geopolitics and diplomacy and state affairs. And in that sense, for me going to Amman, Jordan, and I'll explain the context, well, it's just one more reminder that it's in fact very hard to separate faith, religion, from the religious affairs of our world. And in fact, when we move from ecumenical, now ecumenical we often mean dialogue between Christians, and today most Christian groups are disconnected or unhinged from their former political connections. But it wasn't that long ago, maybe a century ago, that Christians would have to dialogue with a heavy political environment where the state was very much bound up with religious connections. And it's less today, but it is still the case today to some extent. So certainly when we move from ecumenical or intra-Christian to interfaith, which here for me was mostly Christian-Muslim dialogue, certainly there is some amount of, you could say, state affairs. One, because Islam isn't just a faith conviction, it is also bound up with a societal structure or even a political vision. So that's something to keep in mind. Often, we Christians have lost the sense of how much, in fact, of a social, even political dimension there can be in Christianity. So when we move into interfaith, that certainly has to be kept in mind. So I think ecumenical to interfaith is becoming important for a number of reasons, which I will briefly discuss. One is, I think there's a sense of and it's in the course that we're doing called the Ecumenical Winter. There's sometimes a sense that we're not doing progress or achieving progress in ecumenical dialogue. There's a sense that we've done what we could, and so sometimes Christians who have an interest in ecumenical dialogue feel frustrated, feel a little bit antsy that, well, this is just not happening, and want to look at new directions. So dialogue sometimes with groups that are less usual, or sometimes even engage in public debates to try to force the dialogue, one may say, into new directions. So I sense that for many people living in our societies that have a Christian legacy, at least, there's an unavoidable encounter with Muslim friends, co-workers, and I think a natural shift where we transfer our knowledge, our experience, our desire to dialogue from the intra-Christian world to the interfaith world, especially with Muslims. For me, it happened a couple of years ago, and I believe it was during my studies at this wonderful program at the Institute. I wrote a paper which was called Supreme Horizon, which I'll be glad to share, which basically realized that when we look at the growth of the Christian world today, which is mostly in Africa or in Asia, unavoidably Christians and Muslim will encounter an overlap, and it's happening sometimes with difficulty, as we know, in Asia and Africa. So my sense was that some of the books we study in the program, like The Next Christendom, show that this is where growth is happening in Africa and Asia, and these are regions where the encounter with Islam is going to be unavoidable and has to take place. I also discussed that when Muslims are going to encounter Christians in those areas, they will encounter various forms of Christianity, some that we may not always be fully aware of how active they are. And for example, I had in mind Seventh-day Adventists, as well as Jehovah's Witnesses, Pentecostal groups, Mormons or Latter-day Saints. So what we find is that the definition of Christian for a Muslim encountering Christian growth in Africa or Asia, it isn't always going to be the Christian theology that we are more familiar with, at least for me being Orthodox, but also for more historically conservative or normative forms. So I looked at the incredible spectrum of Christianity that is going to be present in Asia and Africa as they will encounter Islam. And Islam itself has a lot more variation and inner controversy than sometimes we realize. So in my paper, A Supreme Horizon, I discuss one area of theology that surprisingly could be useful to Christians because it is not thought about and it has interfaith potential. And that is temple theology. And I evoke the growth of interest in the works of a particular theologian. Her name is Margaret Barker. And she talks about the temple in the Old Testament and the New Testament as a new way to interpret the text, the language, the culture, also with implications for the environment. And she also discusses the potential of this interest for dialogue with Mormons, with Muslims. So I began expanding my my research, one may say, from this purely Christian and you could say historically fairly unified Christian theology where the creed is accepted and there's an historical legacy, to these new Christian groups where we're really broadening the spectrum. to a point where I realized that when we look at the beginning of Islam, it was perceived to be by the first Christian dialogist, to use that term, right? The first Christians who engaged this new movement, which wasn't called Islam so much at the time, and I had in mind St. John of Damascus. When he encounters this new expression of faith, for him, he wants to categorize it within the broader, in fact, Christian tradition, but on the outer periphery. For him, he's really engaging Christian opinions that certainly he feels are incorrect, that he wants to address in different ways. And so, historically, really what we call the interfaith was in fact not called ecumenical, but simply an engagement that the early Christians had with ideas that they felt were somehow coming from the Christian origins. So, in that sense, there's a tradition from John of Damascus to treat a dialogue with Islam as he would have probably treated dialogue with other new ideas, new directions, new voices in the very broad Christian world. So I began looking at Sultan of Damascus as a very interesting figure. Now there's two ways I realized to engage other believers. One is through apology or apologetics. And apologetics basically means that we are going to make the strongest possible case for our position using the best arguments that we have. And typically when there's an encounter that takes place, it's not ecumenical, it's more in the form of debates or attempts to convert. And we see this as a growing movement. I tend to describe this as, I'm right, you're wrong, let me gather all my proof texts and arguments to make the case for my position. And we see this as a growing trend. There are many debates taking place where the point is not to create convergence, but to show who's right and wrong. And we see this taking place. The USA has a lot of apologetics taking place. And in my book, Is a Broken Body, I express concern that apologetics, however popular it may be and appealing to the masses, is certainly not scholarship, because desire to find convincing arguments isn't always the same as finding the most scholarly interpretation of what is actually being meant. So we've seen these debates, these apologetics expressions take place from various sources. And certainly this takes place a lot among Christians. But over the past few years, there's also been an explosion, so to speak, of debates, apologetics between Christians and Muslims. And so this is a fairly new and interesting phenomenon, but it is not interfaith dialogue. Again, it's an attempt to show that one side is right and the other side is wrong. Now, at this juncture, I wanted to mention an event that took place that is certainly central to interfaith activities and perhaps will be something of interest to us. Now, of course, we all know what happened in 2001 in September and the change that has taken place in geopolitics, in the perception also that exists between what we can call broadly the West, which is often thought to be a Christian civilization, but frankly, in my view, is mostly a secular post-Christian civilization. And the Middle East, the broader Middle East, and as some have said, the Islamic world, a state of tension, misunderstanding, sometimes mutual fear. which is why in 2007 a very famous publication was issued on the Muslim side, and maybe this would be something worth mentioning, and for those that have interest to take a look at it. Now, this document is called A Common Word. It was published in 2007, and it was specifically actually addressed to offer a Muslim reply to a speech that took place, I think it was in 2007 to maybe 2006, a speech delivered by Pope Benedict in Germany. And this speech, which is worth reading, had a very strong, at times even a violent reaction in some parts of the Muslim world. It was perceived to be very unfriendly, very unfair by Pope Benedict. At any rate, to address both the papal speech and the reaction that had taken place, a very broad group of Muslim scholars around the world wrote a document called A Common Word. And at first it was signed by perhaps 50, 60, 70 Muslim scholars, and then the number of signatories grew, I think, now to about 300 scholars. So it's a very important document, A Common Word. And it is addressed first, by the way, to Pope Benedict, then addressed to the Orthodox patriarchs and to the Oriental patriarchs, as well as to the other Christian leaders. And basically, A Common Word is a call for Muslims and Christians to enter into a dialogue based on the conviction that ultimately the love for God is what animates those who are sincere in their religion. So love of God, love of neighbor. And a common word is actually an expression that comes from the Quran, in which it is said, let us find a common word between us and you. And it's specifically a directive addressed to Christians and Muslims, or rather to Muslims and Christians, to seek common words. So this document is very important, and as a result, the government of Jordan, which patronized this effort, also submitted to the United Nations a proposal to create a World Interfaith Harmony Week every year, the first week of February. So since 2007, I believe, could be to 2009, I have to check my dates, there is a United Nations endorsed week-long event which tries to echo the call of a common word and to ask organizations around the world to create events, encounters, anything that would foster interfaith dialogue and harmony. So in this context, actually, Euclid organized over 5 days events in various parts of the world. Here in Eureka, California, I delivered a lecture with Humboldt State University, and I read my paper basically on this topic. But also we had events in Ethiopia, in the Gambia, and elsewhere. And to our delight, we were awarded the first prize by the jury, of which the Patriarch of Jerusalem is a member, and we were invited to travel to Amman, Jordan, to receive the first prize from the hands of King Abdullah. So that was quite a tremendous event, and the paper that I wrote was nominated in the prize, and I was invited to present a short speech to this very distinguished audience. Also present was a very well-known Melkite Greek Catholic priest who was very active in this area, and also the president of the World Lutheran Federation, as well as many leaders of Christianity Islam and civil life in the Middle East. So it was quite an event. And so very briefly, I don't want to take too much time, and I will look at my timer and messages from Father Roman, but the thrust of the paper which I authored is to look back on Muslim-Christian dialogue since 2007 and 2009, and to wonder what has happened, and has there been in fact an effort to find common words, so actual words that actually are useful to create better dialogue between Muslims and Christians, and broadly in fact even between people of faith and ecumenically among Christians. I began by discussing the issue of respect and reflecting on the fact that in the Eastern Christian tradition, which is shared in fact by Orthodox and Eastern or Greek Catholic Christians, that a defining icon is the hospitality of Abraham, also called the Trinity. But this icon embodies the Eastern tradition of hospitality, which Abraham expressed, and respect. And so I argued that we need to basically overcome our prejudice, our ignorance, sometimes our fear, by seeking hospitality and growing in respect. Then I look at some words that have not worked to create this dialogue. For example, the word God in Latin theos. And I argue that this word God hasn't been very helpful to us in having precise dialogue. And here in my paper I go back to a particular development that has taken place since a common word, since in fact 2007, 2009, and that's the growth of public debates, public formal debates between Muslims and Christians, and often the theme of the debate, or the thesis, the proposition, is something like, is Jesus God or the Son of God? And you have Christian and Muslim debaters, trying to make their case. Now, my first concern was, I'm not sure that in any of those debates I have heard an effort made, at the end at least, to create some convergence, to try to have, yes, this more synthetic type of approach, as opposed to a conclusion that simply restates why one side is right and the other is wrong. But secondly, I argue that when we ask the question, is Jesus Christ God or the Son of God, we use God in a way that is, in fact, not quite well defined. I argue that from a Christian, from my own Eastern Orthodox Christian perspective, when we say, is Jesus Christ God, we don't mean God in a personal sense, we mean God in a qualitative sense. That's that he's in fact uncreated like the Father, he's timeless. So it's a qualitative sense of God, or theos, as in John 1:1b. When we say, or is he the Son of God, we mean God in the personal and absolute sense, meaning the Father. So I explore how we could better, in fact, define these terms. And then I explore in my paper a unique aspect of the Eastern Greek patristic understanding of the Trinity, which places the emphasis on the fact that even though the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, or theos, meaning they are uncreated, they exist beyond the line that separates uncreated from created, so they exist beyond space and time. However, for the Cappadocians especially, the God the Father is unique in that he is the only unoriginate one. In other words, that there is in this ancient Greek patristic approach to the Trinity a sense that the Son and the Spirit, though they are equally uncreated, they nevertheless are derived. They actually have their existence from the person of the Father. So in the Creed we have, theos, ek theou, so God from, ek, from God. Light from light. So a sense of that, there is a certain sense in which the Most High, so to speak, is the unoriginate Father in that particular Eastern Orthodox understanding of the Trinity. And as John Zizioulas expresses, the great Greek Orthodox theologian, he expresses that this particular approach of the Trinity, he feels, which isn't always expressed, especially say in some of the Western forms, such as Calvinism, and often the debaters come from a Calvinistic perspective. So, according to Zizioulas, this expression is easier to try to converge, to enter into dialogue with Islam, and that was my approach in this paper, to look at a particular possible common word that would not be God or theos, but that would be a more precise terminology. And the second aspect of the paper is to look at a second word, which even among Christians we have debated, and that is the concept of to worship, for which we have the Greek term either proskinesis or proskuneo or latrio. And I show that there's a dialogue there, a tension at times between Catholic and Orthodox Christians who say, well, we can offer proskuneo to, for example, a king, the saints. It doesn't have to be always to God. Whereas typically in the post-Reformation Protestant churches or evangelical approach, we don't like so much this idea that proskuneo could be offered to creatures without creating confusion. At any rate, so it is already an ecumenical point of debate, but also we can transfer certainly to the contention that exists historically, theologically, between Christians and Muslims over how we express worship and to what. And so I take a look in my paper at the account in the Quran, which many Christians aren't aware of, which is the account of God, Allah, creating man, Adam, and asking the angels to express, I'm not sure what is the best, to bow down, to express adoration, to have a physical expression of respect to Adam. And the Quran, of course, the devil Iblis refuses, and through pride, and this is the fall of the angels. Now I show that this particular Quranic account is in fact an ancient, even pre-Christian Jewish tradition, which you can find in the life of Adam and Eve, and that it is alluded to, perhaps even assumed in the New Testament in Hebrew, to the Hebrews 1 verses 4 through 6, when it is said, and when he introduces his firstborn into the world, he says, let all God's angels worship, proskuneo, him. So I open the dialogue to say, well, even in the Quran, you can see that it's possible to express some kind of expression of respect, whatever the term has to be, adoration to Adam. Therefore, there can be a verb that expresses a relative form of worship or respect or adoration, which is physical, which can be distinguished from the supreme form. Therefore, two words exist, I believe, in fact, in Greek and in Arabic, and these words then can become common words to be specific and avoid misrepresenting, perhaps, our positions. So, in summary, I think that both ecumenical and interfaith dialogue take motivation, they take a personal encounter, and as I expressed in my short speech to the audience in Jordan, I think it takes courage. I think it's easy for all of us in our various positions to say nothing, do nothing, and take no risk, because obviously to try to express things in a way that is creative yet faithful to our own tradition, that is going to build bridges, that is not going to be a restatement of what has been stated, not a mere effort to say, well, I'm right, you're wrong, here's more evidence, but I think to try to really create this dialogue in the current context, be it in fact the context in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, the context that we see in the Middle East, in Africa and elsewhere. I think it takes time and courage, and so I think it's very gratifying to see students still enroll in ecumenical studies and to have the courage and the interest to enter into this dialogue, which is so needful. So I will stop here my lecture, and I will be glad to take any questions if there would be any questions typed in the system. Father Roman, I give you back the microphone.
Yes, of course. Please write your questions on the chat window, or just you can send it to my email as well.
And for those who would want to receive the paper that I wrote, I think you can ask Father Roman, and also the initial paper on temple theology called Supreme Horizon. I can also send that.
Father Laurent, I am curious about because for us, mostly for biggest part of Christian, the Muslims is one nation, yes, one stream, but indeed they have at least two biggest streams, Sunnis and Shiites. Which of them are more open to dialogues, and what are the specifics with every directions of Islam? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question, and obviously within these two major subdivisions, there are also other groups and schools and tendencies. I would say that historically, both were able and willing to engage in dialogue. Currently, I would say that there is a moderate Sunni expression which is very broad and very significant, that is the most active. And so, for example, the so-called Aman message, which was published at about the same time as A Common Word, is a reflection of Sunni Islam. Now, both Sunni Islam and Shia Islam, as far as I understand, not being a specialist, also allow for, you could say, a spiritual, even mystical form, or expressions that are often called Sufi. Often we will separate, Sufi Islam as being a third branch, but there is say a mystical or spiritual school that exists within, in fact, both Shia Islam and Sunni Islam, as well as obviously we find that in the various Christian expressions.
Thank you, Father. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, waiting a second for a question, but I am very thankful to you, Father, that you agreed to have a lecture. It is a whole week for you and for us also in Ukraine. So it's I think you also have
Yes, it is Holy Week, but I think all the more. I think as we reflect on you know on the teachings of Christ, I think it's difficult to not hear that we're called to be peacemakers, um, and that we are called to be courageous, and in that sense, Holy Week is a very good time to reflect on what it means for us to be light and salt, and to be really willing to to examine ourselves. Also, something interesting that I noticed is that one of the ancient fathers that we don't mention him very often, his name is Saint Epiphanius of Salamis, who was a church father in I believe it was the late 400s, early 500s, in Cyprus, but who had traveled much. He wrote a book called the Penarion, or the Remedy Against Heresies, and he makes a list of something like 70 false beliefs or heresies that he tries to address and to heal. It's interesting that in his list, he mentions that there were Christians in Arabia that engaged in excess, and he used that term excess, and that they offered sacrifices and cakes and breads to Mary. And it's interesting that, maybe a century and a half later, Islam appears in Arabia, and that when the Quran reacts against the Trinity, it does so by mentioning a Trinity that would seemingly be composed of a Father, a biological Son, and Mary, as if it's really responding to local, perhaps in fact aberrant, deformed expressions. And it's interesting that the rebuke isn't so much expressed in the text against what we would call our official and formal position on the Trinity, but rather forms that were deformed, that were even identified by Saint Epiphanius about a century and a half before. So there's some always interesting things that as we do even at the patristics, we can see the opening to ecumenical methods and to now interfaith dialogue.
Several years ago, our institute invited Mirna Nazur, women from Aleppo, from Syria.
Okay.
And,
yes.
She's mystic. She's a
yes.
Melkite Catholic, and her husband was Syrian Orthodox. So they live in the ecumenical family, and she was suddenly she had a mystical vision, and the icon at their home of Blessed Mary became to produce oil, mirror, and a lot of Christians around this Aleppo region went to their home. It was like a little shrine. And what was interesting that many Muslims came to worship, to appreciate Mary, and because they also have like a big appreciation to Mary. Yeah.
Yes, it's true. What was interesting to me in the Common Word and World Interfaith Harmony Week program is that what they do not want, the jury, is syncretism, and they write so, is they want harmony and dialogue that isn't compromise, but simply a respectful exchange that is constructive. And I think that's very positive, is that they don't want people to really change, for the sake of harmony, but they want people, first of all, to respect each other, to understand the other the other side's, traditions and positions, and to have harmony in that state of coexistence. Now, dialogue certainly is useful. It can lead to sometimes more convergence, less misunderstandings. But it's interesting that sometimes, ecumenical or interfaith dialogue is feared or misunderstood as being it's blending and it's syncretism. But in fact, neither from the Christian side nor from the Muslim side in this particular event and jury is that encouraged. And I think it's important to stress the difference between dialogue and syncretism.
Okay, Father, thank you again for the very interesting lecture and for inspiration to proceed in the interfaith dialogue, to learn about each other, and I wish you to experience this Holy Week very profound closeness of Jesus to us, and to meet his risen from the dead, and to find again a new life which he gave us every time. Thank you, Father, and
Thank you, Father Roman.
God bless you.
Thank you. Same to you. Thank you.